Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's good to have you for this episode, and we've got a special guest. Unfortunately, one of our regulars is not here today. Tom Price is on the road. This is Thanksgiving week, even though this show will probably come out a couple of weeks later than Thanksgiving or after Thanksgiving. We are recording it during the week of Thanksgiving, and of course, Tom has to make his trek down south, his return to the old homestead, and leaves Connecticut behind and spends time with family. So that's where he is right now. But anyway, just in case you don't know who I am or Glenn, let us introduce ourselves. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church just outside of Portland, Oregon, on the Washington side of the Columbia River. And I live in Battleground. And I've written a number of books, and the latest book is In the House of Tom Bombadil, and I'm working on a few others, hopefully that I'll get done before too long. But anyway, that's enough about me. Glenn, why don't you share about yourself?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I work for Reflections Ministries. I'm a freelance writer and teacher. And I have my own ministry as well, Every Square Inch Ministries at esquareinch.org. Okay,
great. All right, so we are joined today by a friend of mine, Rory Groves. Rory, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background, and then maybe a little bit about what you're doing now.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris and Glenn, for having me on the show today. It's a great honor to be joining the Pugcasters here. I've been a fan for several years. Actually, Chris, one of your books, Man of the House, was one of the inspirations for some of the directions that I've gone in my life. So I appreciate your work that you put into this. Yeah. And so, I mean, a little bit about myself. So I'm a tech guy, was a tech guy. I'm not a tech guy anymore. I'm a low tech guy. So we had technical difficulties last time we tried to do this. That's how low tech I am now. But I used to be a tech guy for most of my career. We moved to a farm in southern Minnesota about a dozen years ago, kind of viewed it as maybe a nice diversion, nice place to raise the kids. We lived in Minneapolis at the time. And so we just thought this would be nice. Wouldn't this kind of be like an enhancement on the life circumstances where we're at? And it was those things, and it was a lot of fun. And we did the hobby farming thing for a while. But the reason why I'm not in tech anymore is because I started to observe this contrast between when we worked on the farm. It was as a household centered economy, right? A household economy, or I talk about the family economy. And everything, I just noticed these things were just automatic, where our family, my kids, were integrated into the work that I was doing. I was having all these discipleship moments with my children. I was bonding with my wife. We had this shared vision. There were things that were automatic to the work we were doing. It wasn't like I was sitting down with a business plan. It was just happening. And then the contrast was when I went back to my real job, I was isolated. I was alone. I was staring at a computer screen. I was doing things that my kids couldn't possibly understand what they were doing or what they were for. And so this dissonance just kind of ate away at me for several years until I started thinking more about this idea. And I came across, I think it was Kevin Swanson, where I first heard of the idea, the term of family economy. And then I started reading some more about that term and came across your books, Chris. And then I came across Alan Carlson, Wendell Berry, and just some of these writings and some of these challenges. I started to reevaluate where things were at. And so kind of what made a big shift in my career was I started working on a project which became a book. In the end, wasn't initially planned. I didn't plan to be a writer or an author, but I started writing this book that became Durable Trades, Family-Centered Economies That Have Stood the Test of Time. And that was simply, it was written for men like me who were at a place in their career where they were kind of fed up with the individualistic, materialistic, and the obsolescence of the type of careers that we have in modern society. And we're looking for something to do with their families. That's all it was. It was just a survey of options that are out there for families who want to work together. So that's the long-winded way of introducing myself, but that's how I got into what we're doing now, where we're farming a lot more. We're doing ministry-based events together. We host workshops on our farm. We do writing. we do some travel and speaking a little bit here and there, but we've kind of cobbled together a number of different avenues for our family to be able to be on shared mission and shared labor together. So that's what brings me here today.
Yeah, that's great stuff, Rory. And I think, your book, Durable Trades, has been around a little bit, and I think you've spoken in different places, and it's become, at least in our circle, something that people have heard of and have gotten a lot out of. I think you've gone on to do these things that you just described, and I think that journey is something I want to dig into a little bit. But what prompted getting you on the show today is the second book you've written, entitled "The Family Economy," which I've got right here in case people want to look it up. And the forward is by Alan Carlson, and what do you know? I'm on the back. I've endorsed it, and so did Kevin Swanson. Kevin's a mutual friend of ours, and then of course Alan is also a mutual friend. What prompted this book? You wrote Durable Trades, and then you followed up. Now it's a very quick read. It's not very long, but what prompted you to write this kind of follow up to Durable Trades?
What I was noticing is we would travel around and we would speak and share on this concept of the family economy. And I would very often find young fathers, or not necessarily young, but just family, men with children that were coming up to me and asking, how do I do this?
Right.
Where I'm at. This is my job situation. There's something about this that really resonates with me. Tell me more. And so what I felt was needed is that I wanted to put together something that was a very simple, breezy, quick read that would just distill the main points. I didn't want to write like a whole treatise. I didn't want to go. Maybe there's a time and a place for that. But that's just what I felt like I needed is something very specific and succinct is what I was going for, to explain this concept of the family economy. How did we used to operate? Why did we get away from that? And what are some basic steps to get started in putting that back together? And the way I approached it is I shared our story as one example, not as the example. But then I tried to come up with some very practical things that people could do that you don't have to have, for example, a farm. A lot of people look at, well, I can't, I'm not a farmer. I don't own any land. I'm not a tradesman. I can't do the kinds of things that are mentioned in Durable Trades. And I understand that, and everyone's going to be unique. And so my goal was to try to put something together that was very, almost like an introduction or a primer to the concept. And what people want to do with it from there is kind of their own journey.
Yeah, that's great, because I do think that people tend to, fall into the patterns that you just described. The idea that, okay, if I want to do have a family economy, I've got to be a farmer or a tradesman. For similar reasons, that question comes up with me a lot. People ask me, well, what am I supposed to do? And, generally what I do is I say the concept is the main thing. It's not, the particular thing that you're doing. So, you can even say that, I know this might sound absurd, but I think it actually is the case that Donald Trump has the family economy. If you think about it, now, yes, he's got this huge set of things that he's engaged in, but who does he work with all the time? Yeah. Who do you see him standing next to all the time? And it's not just for photo ops. Mm-hmm. These people actually work together every day. The Trump family, it's a family concern. It is. And by the way, that's actually what I see a lot. When you get to the higher levels of our society, you run into this. So like the Waltons, who are behind Walmart, or the Mars family, who are behind Mars Candy. Those are family companies. Yeah.
We have Cargill up here, which is a major employer. Yeah.
I notice you're not mentioning the Bidens.
Well, we want to have a constructive family economy. Yeah, but isn't it an interesting contrast that what you have with, say, that family, the Bidens, is clearly a dysfunctional and a family sort of setting in which when we think about the family, that family, we think about Hunter and all of his problems, right? Now, I don't know enough about the Trumps to say anything of value with regard to what the children are like, but it seems as though they're not dealing with the same problems. In fact, Trump is known for discouraging anything like that with his kids in terms of his own personal conduct, right? He doesn't even imbibe. He won't drink a glass of wine, let alone, whiskey. And I saw this interaction with him and his son, Barron, when Barron was small. Barron is like a giant now, but when he was small, his wife brought Barron into Trump's office, and he came by to see his father and say hi. And then Trump just gave him a lecture about the importance of good grades and staying away from cigarettes, alcohol, drugs. Don't ever let me catch you with any of those things. And but already Barron is apparently contributing to the family concern, because he was the one that encouraged his father to go on the podcast with Joe Rogan. And so,
wow.
But anyway.
Well, that brings up that's a really good point, because one of the roles that you play as a father that I play as a father that I think historically fathers have played is to create an enterprise, an opportunity for your children to enter into. Right. I mean, we have this mindset today, largely because it's been happening this way for so many generations, that, the extent of our involvement in our children's career ends when they get sent off to the high school guidance counselor and they pick a degree in college. And many of those are not carrying forward on, the foundation that the parents have built, that the wisdom that they have accumulated, spent a lifetime accumulating. But if you view it as, I need to create an economy for my children to enter into, to learn, it's not just the economics of it. In other words, it's not just about where can I earn the most money, but where can I develop character? And this work is a great place to develop character. And so I think that's part of the family economy idea is just that. It is being more involved in your children's future, you're preparing opportunities for your children, for your grandchildren, and extending it in a very practical way that keeps the relationships intact, rather than just everyone, graduating off into wherever land and losing the intactness of those relationships that you've spent already 10 or 20 years building.
Yeah, those are great points. I think when it comes to this particular matter, it's not hard for people to envision or sort of justify doing it. It comes down to often how to go about it, like you mentioned. And I think it's worthwhile maybe reviewing your own story a little bit, because you start off in tech. But it wasn't like overnight that you got into the spot you are now. Can you give us a little, sort of a, I guess, description of and then get into some of the details of frustrations and the timelines, because I think for a lot of guys, they hear about this and because it seems magical, they think it will happen quickly, and when it doesn't, they quit or they get discouraged. Can you maybe give us a little bit of a sense of what it took?
Very true, and I can sympathize with that, and I certainly have had many conversations with families that are struggling with the expectations that they have. The biggest mind shift that has to happen is that you're not replacing your income necessarily with the family economy, at least not right away. You're going to take a big hit. And you have to be okay with that. But you have to look at it kind of like a long-term investment. This is not going to be a short-term turnaround. Now, in the short term, you're going to gain a lot of benefits because you're going to have opportunities with your family and with your children and your marriage that you didn't have. But in terms of the economics, it's not going to work out on paper right away. And I don't encourage people to try to do something drastic overnight. I mean, unless you feel called by God to do something very drastic.
And you got a big savings account.
And you got a lot. You're going to eat into your savings account if you do this. This is going to be part of it. Right. But so for us, it took us about 5 years, is what I would say. From the point,
that's good to hear. That's good to hear, because that would be the thing that I would tell people too. Yep. Minimum 5 years to make the transition.
And as a matter of fact, it's interesting you say that, because Kevin Swanson was out here last year for our conference, and I asked him about this. We had a whole conversation. He said it took them about 7 years from him to make a switch, a transition to what his former, I forget what he was involved in. He trained as like a biologist or a secular or some kind of technical degree, I think. Anyway, but it took him 7 years for his family. And the other thing that you have to realize is it's probably not going to be just going from one job to one job.
Right.
It's like one job at work, one job at home. You're probably going to be cobbling together several different avenues of income to make a living, to make a livelihood. And I mean, I know for the Kevin, I like to repeat this. He says, people ask him, do you have a 1-income household or a 2-income household? And he says, we have a 17-income household. He said, my daughter's my daughter's raising puppies. I'm writing books, and we're doing a ministry at the church, and we're doing, there's so many different things, and that's kind of how you have to approach it.
Yeah, like in our situation with my wife and I. Now we're 60 in our 60s, and this has been a long project. But between us, there are 9 income streams. So you have to think in those terms, and that's just 2 people, 9 income streams.
So when we that's fantastic, and that's not even counting what your children are doing now too. Right. Yeah, they're probably all in multiple income streams as well. The other aspect of that is you got to think about income a little differently. I mean, you have the opportunity. You don't have to fit neatly into the mold of where you came from, what the modern economic system pertains to. So, for example, we live on a farm. It's a small farm. We have 10 acres in southern Minnesota. We made the decision that we're not going to try to turn the farm into an income producing asset, but we're going to turn it into a productive asset in the sense of we're going to feed ourselves as much as we can right from our own farm.
Well, let's stop there a second, because I think that some people have lost sight of the value of subsistence economies. And subsistence economies are already being recovered. For example, I would call a homeschooling family a subsistence economy. Perfect. In other words, you're doing something. So maybe mom is putting in most of the effort. But if you were to pay somebody else to do the work, it would be a pretty significant investment to have somebody else educate all of your children. So insofar as she's doing the lion's share of the work, she's contributing to the subsistence economy.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. I just wrote about that recently. Subsistence is not a dirty word. And I'm trying to implore people to think about, back in the day, people, there really was not a money economy. People sold the surplus of what they didn't need. Now we kind of have it backwards. Now we produce everything to sell it first and then go out and buy what we need. Right. But historically, people produced what they needed, and they did it at home. They did it with their families. And they lived very simply. Of course, that's also probably going to be involved in a family economy. You're probably going to have to simplify certain things. You're going to have to make a value judgment on your priorities.
This brings back a virtue that we've lost touch with, and that's thrift.
Yes.
Like, when was the last time you heard anybody talk about thrift? But that was something that, our ancestors talked about all the time.
Yeah, right. It was a virtue. It's not a virtue anymore. Yeah.
So in fact, we're told that it's bad for the economy to be thrifty. It's good for the economy to go in debt, so that you can kind of keep the factories churning.
Consumption based. That's exactly it. So there's a lot of paradigms, I guess, is what I'm getting at, that you can step outside of, whether it's subsistence. So just to use the subsistence example in our case, I consider the farm a very integral part of our family economy, even though it doesn't make a dime. But we break even or thereabouts break even, but we supply the greater part of our needs right from the farm, which is phenomenal. I think that's very stable. It involves the children in the work. It really gives us an opportunity to, communicate our values to our children, to disciple the children, and we never have to leave home. Now
like when we think about that, let's just get into the food element. We think about just the fact. I know you have chickens. Obviously, there are egg. You have egg layers, but you also have broilers. I've seen you raise cattle. I've seen you raise sheep.
Not cattle, but sheep and goats. Yeah.
When didn't you? One time I saw you had a side of beef that you took a picture of?
It was. I was working at a butcher shop for that picture. Yeah.
Okay, so that wasn't something you raised, but
it wasn't my own beef. Yeah, but I was.
Okay.
I was training. I was learning a trade.
Right.
But yeah, so so we have chickens and goats and sheep and hogs. We'll raise some hogs in the.
So in terms
summertime.
of your protein, you've got a lot that you're producing for yourself. What would you say is the percentage of the food that you raise that covers your own family needs? I mean, how much are you producing for yourselves?
So the goal is 100%, but we're not there yet. Mm-hmm. I would say that we have about 90% of our protein covered. Mm-hmm. We raise 100 chickens a year, and we will either butcher lamb and hog, or we might buy in like a side of beef if we don't, things that we don't raise. Mm-hmm. On the vegetable side, we're getting there. We put in, every year we're doing a little bit more. My son, I put him in charge of the garden this year. Ivor, he's 14 now, but he was 13 when he started, and he did a phenomenal job. It was our best year ever in the garden. Put away like 300 pounds of potatoes and 200 quarts of vegetables. So we're not quite there on the all the food side, but I would say that we're depending on the time of year, we're somewhere north of 50 to 70% of our own, covering our own needs.
So let's think about just those two things, because I know you homeschool.
Yep.
So the costs, if you were to send your child off to private school, that's a significant savings there. Mm-hmm. You're probably not going to be interested in public school anyway.
Probably not.
So so you're doing something there that's productive, that is subsistence and character. We all have to eat. Yep. And you're producing food for yourselves, and your children are involved in the process and are learning about where food comes from and how it's grown and that kind of. So there's a lot of value there.
Oh yeah.
So
and it's quality food. If you think, this is all organic. This is all raised on pasture. This kind of stuff. We would not be able to afford to live on this kind of food. I'll just put it bluntly.
That's right.
So we raise it.
There you go. That's right. Yeah, you got the markup for the organic
exactly.
And the hipster factor.
Right.
So you got hipster diet,
yes.
but
not McDonald's here.
Right. Contrasting with the Trump family.
Yeah, exactly. RFK.
They could afford organic food. Well, we'll see. We'll see what RFK does for them.
Yeah, that was a little odd to see a little contrast there. Let's see.
Yeah, but anyway, so that's not an insignificant set of expenses. Now, people might say that, okay, fungibility, this is often the argument people will use. We'll think about what you could earn in the market economy with the time that you're investing there. Well, but a couple of things here to consider. One is that the costs that are moral in character by sending your kids to school, public school, or even some Christian schools, is significant. So there's a cost that you would incur if you did that. But then there are also costs, I think, that people don't factor into this way of thinking when they think about fungibility in terms of opportunity costs that you have lost out on when you don't raise your own food. So you got, how many kids have you got now?
We have six kids.
So 6, and you got them. So you got some labor,
some mouths. Yeah, we got some labor and we got some mouths. So I don't know if it's a net neutrality yet.
But at the same time, you could say, well, think about all the benefits. In fact, you could send your kid off to school, and then they would take a trip to the farm and have like a field trip.
Oh yeah.
You don't need to do that. You've got the actual farm.
Well, and I think I did some exploring on this. If you think about it in terms of a supply chain. So it's kind of like the difference between renting and owning a supply chain is how I would put it. And a lot of the cost savings that you're getting in a grocery store is because you're renting the supply chain. Someone else has put in all the cost of ownership, and you're renting a small part of that, to get your food to you, which works well and is actually more efficient than trying to do it yourself, because it's a higher cost of ownership to do it all yourself. But if there's a disruption to the supply chain, guess what? It's the person who owns the supply chain that actually has the food in the end. And we saw that during 2020 when things were shutting down. We had, our freezers were full of food. I talk about that in the book a little bit. And we had people calling us saying, hey, can you sell us some chickens? Mm-hmm. And I said, we sold, we already sold our chickens to our customers that we knew beforehand, and we don't we're not raising any more until next year. And so there's a temporary savings, I guess you could say, by going purely on looking at the economics of it. What's the most efficient and the cheapest way to do it? Well, that's going to be what the global supply chain can provide you. That's always going to be cheaper. Mm-hmm. But if you actually want the stability, and I do, and the preparedness, and I do, mm-hmm. then you have to look at some other factors that might not be quantified in that price of, tomatoes at the grocery store.
Right. Now, what I want to go back to something that we said earlier, that when we're talking about family economies, we're not talking necessarily about tradesmen or farmers.
Sure. Right.
So your discussion here is focused on people who've got land to raise chickens, lambs, pork, and have large gardens. I suspect that a lot of our listeners might not fall into that category.
Sure enough.
So what do you have to say to those of us, for example, like me, who are in the middle of suburbia, surrounded, in my case, by golf courses when I don't play golf, and I'm not on the golf course, but we've got golf courses all around, and all of this sort of thing. I'm in a very suburban area, so I'm not exactly in a position to do the sorts of things you're talking about. So,
well, and what I was going to say, and Chris was already touching on, and this is the opportunity cost, mm-hmm. is that as nice as it is to have stability and to have have the land to do some of these things on, the family economy really is not about the land. It's really about the relationships, is what I would say. What I'm building more than anything else is an opportunity to have stronger relationships with my children, with my wife, and to build something that's a generational inheritance. But that has to be, you know how some of these wealthy families can be too. They can have, what is it? Wealth lasts 3 generations. You can build up an economic inheritance and completely lose your family in the process. And so the real, for me, the real core is working on the character and the relationships and working out from there. Where, in other words, the modes of work are things that actually support your virtues, your values as a family. You're bringing them in based on that. You're not trying to fit your family into the work, for example, into the economic opportunity. And so,
let me just comment here a little bit on the question that Glenn has raised, because it's a good question and it comes up a lot. Mm. And I think the larger challenge is, even when you have the land, you still have a lot of work to try to bring something into being out of just raw land. But anywhere you find yourself, there's going to be the challenge of making the transition from what you're doing now as, say, someone who's participating in the corporate economy and you don't have a household economy to speak of, to what you want, which is something that gets the family working together. And I think this is where some creativity and kind of an assessment of the particular situation you find yourself in is important. Now, I do think some people have a more entrepreneurial sort of bent, and they're going to find sort of opportunities easier to identify. But what do you do with, say, somebody who doesn't have that bent, maybe is not sort of entrepreneurial and sort of the way they look at the world? Any thoughts?
I think that people they have the capacity to be a lot more entrepreneurial than they probably let on.
I agree.
You made the point one time that 100 years ago, 90% of the country, or 90% of the population were proprietors. Mm-hmm. And today it's about 10%. So something happened there that was not entirely in our DNA. But to answer that question, I'm glad you brought that up, both of you, because we do an exercise. I put it in the back of the book, but we talk through this whole idea of a family gifts inventory as a way to try to discern what you could do together as a family that would take the best use of your assets and your collective, knowledge and wisdom and education and interests and passions, but not just stopping with, a lot of times these assessments or these kind of career guided questions, they're very individualistic in their approach. We're coming at it from saying, what is mom and dad? Let's start there. What is mom and dad uniquely gifted to do? What could they do together that they couldn't do individually. And you just kind of, you compare out and you ask these questions, and anyone can just do this at home. Sit down, get out a piece of paper, write out what makes you unique. And then if you're in a marriage, you're in a lifelong covenant. What could it be that God had put for you to do as a married couple, right? That's unique to your family. And again, every family this is why I don't try to direct people into farming per se. Because every family is going to have different opportunities and different assets and different education, and skill sets and propensities and training. Now you start to bring your children into that equation. And you say, okay, so not only are we brought together as one flesh under God, but why did he put these particular beings in our family with these particular, let's call them strengths that are undeveloped at this point? And, all these different propensities that they have, God put them in your family for a reason. Why? Because he wants you to do something together with them. It's not just so that they can be sent off one day in a certain direction or certain career. He wants you to do something together as a family unit. And there is something there that you can do while the children are under your roof. So it's a little bit of a longer, more nuanced answer to what you're asking, Glenn, but it is, I think, the best approach to it is you have to come up with some kind of vision that fits your family, what that might actually be. And then you need to start pulling on that yarn to see where that's going to lead. Because I can tell you where we started, I did not see us ending up in the place that we're at, but it fits us very well for the season that we're in right now.
Yeah, knowing you, Glenn, and your family, as I do, obviously your niche is education.
Yeah.
So
and that was less a question. I mean, Lynn and I, our kids are off. I mean, so I mean, I was asking the question less about me personally and more sort of like, okay, I'm in a suburb. I suspect a lot of our listeners may be too. What then? How do you apply that in that circumstance?
Well, let me just sort of play with this a little bit, just because I know about your situation, because you're already doing this. You're already producing content, and your daughter has also got a PhD, and you've got a son who is a content producer who's good at the very things that you need help with to get your content out.
And guess who's doing that?
Yeah, that's right. So you're already doing it. Now, it may not be as large as you need it to be, but you're got some things that are valuable that you can share for income, and you're building it. I know that you are. And I think that's kind of the thing that we just should have everybody kind of like thinking about more creative. Now, I think one of the things too that comes into play here, Rory, sometimes people think, okay, this is entirely up to our particular little family to figure out. But I've noticed that the most successful environments that I've seen this sort of thing really develop in is in situations where there are many families who are kind of relating to each other and know each other well and working together. And then there are kind of even churches where this sort of thing is much more, I guess, the norm than other churches.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it just compounds from there. I mean, if you have an alignment of beliefs and culture, the opportunity, I mean, what you're describing is a village, essentially. It's a pre-industrial village where they were completely self-sufficient because they could all depend on each other to produce the things that they needed. And when you take a family economy mindset and you take that into a congregation, for example, you have a group of families that are thinking this way, there's going to be loads of opportunities that didn't otherwise exist with an individual family trying to go it alone. So absolutely, families should be looking to spend time with and to discuss and meet and worship with other families of similar mindset. Because not only themselves, it might better themselves in their own business, but it might also provide opportunities for their children, keeping the culture. And that's a huge thing is, you want to keep the culture of the intact that you worked so hard as parents to train your children in. And when they go into a workplace, they're going to really meet the real people inside those workplaces. And so if you have godly men and women that can mentor your children that aren't you, it actually is a very healthy opportunity for children to get to understand and respect authority that's beyond their parents. So that's essentially apprenticeship model that we used to all have.
Yeah, I was just at a bakery coffee shop that has just been started by a couple in my church, and it's become phenomenally successful. I mean, literally, the line is out the door.
Wow.
And so they produce all their own baked goods. It's really. I think it's going to become well, it already is almost a cult, the sense. But a lot of it is, a lot of the success is due to the fact that, these are people who are really well networked into their community, not just in our church. Our church is a fairly good sized church and has a lot of connections. But we're in a setting where a lot of the churches have people who know each other. And so there's this sort of kind of networking effect that goes way beyond our local church. And even beyond the churches. There's a lot of goodwill in the community. But when I went in there today, I think maybe I saw 8 to 10 people working behind the counter, and maybe 6 or 7 of them were kids from my church, teenagers and young adults from my church who now work in that business. And I know their families also have this mindset. And so there's a lot of sort of interconnectedness and good, healthy mentoring going on.
Wonderful.
And then, the challenge that they're dealing with is how can we get better so that the line moves faster?
It's a good problem to have.
That's a good problem. Yeah, it's a good problem. But that's kind of what they're dealing with right now. And they're all kind of learning together and developing. And we have people in our church who are really, got a background in the restaurant world, and are kind of coming alongside and coaching them a little bit because but this is the dynamic, that you have.
Oh, I mean, and we're going to need that, Chris. I mean, frankly, I think going forward, we're going to need to have, we talk about a family economy. We're going to need to have church-based economies. We're going to need to have families that can find support and community within the context of a Christian culture, and not just depend on, hiring random people off the internet, but really being able to find quality, competent individuals that are trained where you have the opportunity to really shape and mold them, something that's beyond just a paycheck, but you're actually pouring into someone's life in a mentorship context. I think this is good. This is needed. And churches, I think, should really be taking this subject. You're a pastor. You can tell the other pastors. They should take this very seriously in their congregations, to really try to develop this intentionally, because I do think that this is going to be more and more important as time goes on.
Yeah, that's really great. So let's go back to your story a little bit more, Rory. So you were there in the world of high tech. You're like a code guy, right?
Code guy, exactly.
So you're sitting in front of a screen all day.
Yeah.
You want to spend more time with your family and your kids. You buy some land, out in the country outside of Minneapolis, and then you move out there and you start doing stuff. So what did you do first, and what came second? And
you got to start with chickens. Chickens are the gateway drug to homesteading. So once you start chickens, you'll have goats pretty soon, and then all kinds of honeybees and things like that. No, it was very much a hobby at the beginning. It's not a hobby now. That doesn't mean that it's lucrative, but it means that we work hard for it. Right. But we had a lot of fun with it starting out, and I didn't have the mind that I didn't want to turn it into like a job, so to speak, which is exactly what I actually did. But I mean that in the sense of like a soul crushing type of corporate job where I wanted to really enjoy it. And so I was very careful when I took things on. I was very slow about it and deliberate about what our capacity was as a family. Now,
in terms of what you were doing for income during this time. So
I was still, for the first several years, I was still doing contract programming. I had a software business. I was selling software retail. So I was very much immersed in that. It wasn't really until about, as I said, 5 years into this journey that I was able to actually pull the plug on that old way of life. And I was able to go full time. So the iterations of what happened is we wrote this book, which opened up a lot of doors for us. It resonated with a lot of other people, and we got invited to be part of, conferences and other conversations, and to write more and things like that. And then we also saw one of the things that was in the book that we liked was was also education, I guess you would say, but informal education. Tutoring was one of the things that came out of durable trades. And we thought, we can use our farm as a venue, and we can invite people to come out here And we decided to do it as a ministry, as a Christian ministry, and that allowed us to be able to raise sponsorships and donations to kind of keep the funds low, to keep the prices low for our guests, because our main ministry field is a lot of large families that are homeschooling. They don't have a ton of money. They can't go to a $800 a day per person homesteading workshop. So we felt that our reach was to try to encourage this idea of the family economy and help to rebuild it. And we wanted to do it deliberately as a Christian ministry. And that's what we've done. So we've been very, very upfront about our beliefs and try to present the scripture right alongside what, when we're talking about family work and those kinds of things. And just slowly but surely, this started to grow and expand, and more invitations came along. And we had a little newsletter that we used to write. We started writing as a family. And when I say newsletter, we stuffed it in the mail and put stamps on it, and all the kids would contribute little articles, and this thing just continued to grow. And after a couple of years of this, we saw there's a real opportunity here to kind of get into more publishing, teaching, and writing as a family business, and that's what we're doing now.
So the farm itself is kind of a subsistence of a concern, and today the family business is more education.
Yeah, education, exactly. Yep. And I would say, kind of blurring in with ministry too, because there's a lot of things that we do that don't necessarily pay economically, but it's a very worthwhile thing to do with our kids, so that we do. Yeah. We're happy to do it.
Yeah. So this is a good way to kind of think about it. So what you're really talking about in terms of your family business is an education business.
Yeah.
And that's somebody with a handle to kind of like say, okay, now that could apply to lots of different things. Obviously, Glenn has an education business, and a lot of people can do that. In all sorts of settings. You could be, in New York City and living in an apartment and kind of stuff. Now, when it comes to the...
Can I
go
jump
ahead,
in?
Glenn. Sure.
It's an interesting thing. I don't think it's a business for the guy, but there's somebody who made a big splash on YouTube putting out videos of just how to do stuff, things that dads used to teach their kids. But because there are so many fatherless kids out there, or dads who aren't teaching these things, how to tie a tie, how to change a tire, all of these little odds and ends, basic things that weren't getting passed down anymore. This guy became I don't know if he's still doing it, but he was a huge thing on YouTube a while ago, just doing basic things like that.
Yeah, I remember the guy you're talking about, and knowing how YouTube pays, I imagine that he was doing pretty well.
I'm guessing he might be, yeah.
Just teaching people how to tie a tie. But I think that's, I guess the thing is that's a particular avenue that is not directly related to some of the. Well,
sure.
The hurdles.
That's not a family thing. But the point is, there are all kinds of things that need to be taught.
Exactly.
And like I said, it's not a family thing. But
and in our case, this is what this is kind of going back to that example I talked about earlier. But in our family, we have certain gifts for things, and writing and teaching turned out. I was a programmer. I didn't even know that this is kind of a latent gift that I discovered after the fact. I had never written anything. I'd never really taught anything besides just when you're an entrepreneur, you're kind of always in front of people anyway. But these were things that we discovered along the way. And my wife has a huge heart for hospitality. She's a people person. She loves being a gatherer of events. And so these are things that just blended together with our family. And once it clicked, not everything, most of what you try might not work. And that's a constant part of a course correcting. So, but once it does click into place, you can kind of follow where the gifts and the path is leading. And you can stumble into some real good success doing those kinds of things.
I think, related to bringing family into stuff, even with like a YouTube channel, I think there are lots of ways for family members to contribute, even if they're not visually on the screen, if you get my drift.
Certainly.
But when we think about this whole matter of bringing kids in, it is true that things that have a manual nature are going to be easier for littler people to kind of get involved with right away. Little 5-year-old kids can go out and collect eggs, for example.
Yeah.
But they're not going to write code.
They're not. No.
But even so, if you have a mind for it and you're looking for ways to bring your family into a business, there are more ways that they can be involved than you might assume initially.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And be involved in helping make it a success. And I guess that's the thing, have a mindset for that.
Yeah, absolutely. You might be able to just shift around what you're already doing in a new way, to kind of rebrand or to reinvent what you're already doing. It's hard to do that if you're working in a corporate job. I understand, that there's very limited options there. In my case, I had to just quit because it wasn't going to go in the direction that I wanted it to go. I could see I have a limited amount of time with these children under my roof, and I want to invest as much as I can. And so I chose to just completely go another direction. And for me, the calculus was worth it, even though it was not as lucrative as a direction if you look at it on bank accounts, but it's far more rewarding. And I think most of the guys that are thinking along these lines, they're not in it for the money. They're looking for fulfillment and meaning in their work. And they get that. And so I think that most people understand there's a sacrifice involved, at least initially. But in the long term, it far outweighs any initial sacrifice that you need to make.
Let me just kind of expand on this a little bit, because I think even there's a tendency for people to fall into a kind of corporate way of approaching their work that isn't serving their family's interests, and they don't even necessarily need to do it that way. So let me give you an example. So in your book, Durable Trades, you identify the ministry, pastoral ministry, as a kind of durable trade, and I agree. I'm not even threatened by AI and deep fake preachers, because generally people do want a human being to be their pastor. But anyway, one of the things that sometimes you see is guys who are in the ministry adopt a kind of corporate mindset and create a kind of approach that reflects sort of the professional I guess etiquette or sort of pattern that they see their congregates following, which is kind of crazy. So they end up dividing up their life to look more like a guy who's a senior vice president at XYZ Corp. The way they approach the church, the way they think of their home life. There's this huge kind of space separating home life from the church and its work. Whereas actually a pastor's home is based on the old model.
Yeah.
And I joke about this sometimes with people. I'd say, okay, let's say you were applying for a position at, I don't know, Microsoft, and they brought you in, and the first question they asked you was, tell us about your wife. Well, immediately you're like, what do you want to know about my wife for? But that's the first question often, or the second question you get when you are candidating to serve a church. Tell us about your family, because the thinking is the old way of thinking, which is it's not just about you, dude. Your household and how you conduct yourself in your household, and then even the fact that we do expect your wife. Like, let's say you were candidating in a church and they asked you about your wife and said, "Well, my wife isn't even a believer. Why do you want to know about her anyway? She's an atheist. She won't be coming to church." Well, then immediately you don't get the job. But
hopefully,
but that wouldn't be the case at Microsoft. Microsoft would say, first of all, they would never even go there. But there are a lot of guys.
My wife uses an Apple computer.
but there's a sense in which this is kind of the default position for pastoral ministry is the pre-modern way of thinking about the relationship between the profession and the household. And there are guys who, because of their infatuation with the efficiency and size and bling of the corporate world, mimic it in the ministry. And so a lot of these guys who have, the big box, big Eva church thing going, they really do behave more like a CEO or a senior vice president at the insurance company, and then they behave like the Apostle Paul or Peter or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
Now, Chris, there's another side to this. I remember a friend of mine back in the late 70s. This is before the big box Eva, who was single and was an interim pastor at a church, and the church really wanted him to become their permanent pastor, but the district superintendent of the denomination would not let him do it because he was single, because he wanted a married couple there, because then they'd have two workers for the price of one.
Oh, and if I was a district superintendent, I would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
And the reason is because you really do get two for the price of one.
Right.
So my wife has been a tremendous asset. And now people might say, well, what about Jesus? What about the Apostle Paul? Well, I'm not an apostle and I'm not Jesus. Okay.
Glad we got that cleared up.
That's right. But so my thought is that what you really are hiring is you are hiring a family. So like when my kids were small, it was not a choice to go to church. It was not a choice to behave in church. It was not a choice to be a leader in the youth group. Those things were expected because they were the pastor's child. And so what we would do all the way along is we would say, this is a family ministry. This is not just dad's job. This is a family ministry. But and you can communicate that to your kids and get it across in a good way. And the idea that you should have the same prerogative as a person who has this wall separating his home from his work is not someplace a pastor can go. But that's actually a good thing. Yeah. And if you try to live that way, then what you end up doing is you end up giving you can even communicate to your children the wrong thing, which is that the church is somehow an imposition on our families' life but what we ought to see instead is the reverse happen, that people, just generally speaking, think of their families as a ministry, not just the children receiving, but the children being encouraged to minister, encouraged to think of themselves as being part of the family's ministry and doing things like when you think about hospitality or whatever. Yeah. So I guess my point is that there are ways to approach even the things that we might not assume as being kind of family friendly things to be engaged in, because we just aren't thinking about it. We're not applying ourselves.
Yeah, we've been living under the industrial mindset for 200 plus years in this country. It's very difficult to break out of that pattern of thinking. And a lot of people, when they're intrigued by this idea of the family economy, they want to know how they can, replace their income of say $80,000, $90,000 a year by moving to a farm. And I'm like, sorry to break it to you, you're not going to replace your income, but you're gonna gain in other ways that are a lot less tangible, but they're very real. And one of the things that you're describing with your children being part of the family business is that one of the things that I've seen is the character, the confidence, the maturity that these children take on at a very early age. Right. If you come out, and you were here, Chris, a couple of years ago. I mean, my kids were quite a bit younger then, but when we're hosting an event, our kids are right there in the middle. Sometimes they're leading workshops. Sometimes they're just facilitating, welcoming the guests. They're having conversations. They're picking it up for mom and dad, essentially. You could not buy an education that is better than putting your kids into a family business and having them learn alongside mom and dad. I mean, it is amazing how quickly they adapt and they learn these skills. Ivor, my 13, 14-year-old son, at our conferences when he's running the booth now, because I'm off speaking at a session, he'll be explaining to the adults that are passing by what the family economy is, how the Industrial Revolution tore down this concept, and what we need to do to rebuild it. And he can do the entire speech, so to speak, only because he had to. I mean, Ivory, you got to share if people have questions about these books. I'd like you to explain it to them. And he's happy to do so. And you can see how much confidence it instills in our children when they're meaningfully engaged. And that's the key word. They're meaningfully engaged in the family business.
When you own a business, you also have the ability to bring your kids into things that you wouldn't be able to bring them in if you didn't have the ability to like define the conditions for your employment.
Yeah.
So, for example, we both know of a man in my church who's got a very successful, large business, and his kids are engaged in all kinds of stuff. He's taking them to meetings. He's bringing over high-powered people to his home for dinner, and the kids are, getting to listen in on conversations about, deals that are being done and different kinds of things. So there are ways to I guess my larger point is there are ways that we can pull things together and get the dynamic that we're trying to see recovered here, brought into situations that maybe people wouldn't immediately think were conducive to it.
Yeah, our children are. In fact, we were just hiring for a new position with our ministry, and it was a great interview. And I said, we think this is going to work out, but we need to have another interview because you're going to be spending a lot of time with our family if you join our team. And so we had a second interview, and our kids all. 5 or 6 of them. I don't. One of them was probably sleeping, but they all joined, and they did it. We did a family interview, and we kind of went through, and they had a chance to ask questions and get to know. Yeah. And then we're done. After the interview, we're done, and it's like, okay, kids, what do you think? And they all got the thumbs up. They love this person. You're like, no hesitation, Dad, go for it.
Right.
But that's like a real world experience that it wasn't a unit study in, sociology. Right. It was like, this is just what we're doing, and we're going to bring you along with it. But they know too that I depend on them to be part of what we're doing. Otherwise, we're missing the point otherwise.
Yeah. You're going to say something, Glenn. I cut you off.
Yeah. Now I'm going to kind of spiritualize this whole thing, because one of the things that I think we forget is that the vast majority of the things that we build on earth are not going to last into eternity. What is going to last into eternity are people. And what we're talking about here is really building into people. We are investing in relationships. We are investing in people. And these things do have dividends in this world, but they actually have dividends that extend well beyond this world into eternity. And things like building character, building integrity, building the relationships, instilling truth in people, all of these things are things that matter not just in this world, but that have actually eternal value. And we don't normally think in those terms. But I'm currently working on some material. It just turns out today. That was talking about stewardship. And that was one of the key points that it was emphasizing. We talk about stewardship in terms of time, talent, and treasure. But Ken Boa, the guy I'm working with on this, says we also need to think about it in terms of truth and relationships, because time, talent, and treasure really are tools to build truth and relationships, because those are the two things that are going to be eternal. And what we're talking about here is really essentially that. We may lose out on income right now, but we're building something that is going to have truly lasting value.
Right. Yeah, well put. And I would say for any of those that are out there that are trying to think of they're kind of confronted with this dilemma of I'd like to do something with my family, but I don't see it being practical. Again, It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of experimentation to figure out what fits your family. But don't let that stop you from trying something. Just do something together with your family. Maybe it's just going out and visiting a nursing home and ministering to people. Family ministry is a real thing. Maybe it's I hate to use the example of lemonade stand, but maybe there's something you could do at the farmer's market, and you could do it a couple times in the summer. But there's something that you can do to begin the process, because it's really, like Glenn was just saying, it's more about the relationships and giving some opportunity for things to ferment and to grow. If you wait until you have the perfect opportunity, or you wait until you buy a farm, or you wait until you buy a property that you're going to, say, renovate and rent out, the big opportunities don't tend to come along as often unless you're focusing on the small little steps that'll get you there. So that would be my encouragement, a takeaway just from this conversation, is think about something. It might not be everything, but there's probably something that you can start even today. I tell people, family worship. Can you work? If you're not doing this already at home, this is something that is another form of subsistence, but can you bring the family together and just start to pray together, just to read the scripture together? Be very intentional about that. And that will lead to bigger and better things in and of itself. And every family can do that no matter where they live.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great note to end on. We've come to that point where we should wrap things up. This has been a great conversation, Rory. What are the ways that people can follow you? Is there, a website, some other things that people can connect with you through?
Sure. If you go to gatherandgrow.us, that's our ministry website set up there. You can come find our newsletter that we send out for free. You can find our books, some audio resources from different conferences that we've held, gatherandgrow.us, and sign up for the newsletter. It'd be a great way. We write about this. We send it out quarterly and try to share useful information for families that are kind of going through the steps here, the process of trying to build their family economies.
Great. I don't know if people can hear, but my wife is teaching piano in the background.
Yeah, and I did hear it. I like it.
She's got some kids over that she's got about 30, 40 kids she teaches all the time. Anyway, why don't we wrap things up? It's been great to have you here for this episode of the Theology Pugcast, and I have been forgetful. I've forgotten to mention again and again that we have a documentary on Canon Plus, the Pugcast at Oxford, and we encourage you to check that out. And also, we encourage you to check out our Patreon page, which is a way for you to support what we do here. We don't put any money in our pockets, Glenn and I and Tom. We just do this because we just like to talk. But we still have bills to pay with regard to producing the show, and people who give to us through Patreon make that happen. So we invite you to do that. We'd love to give some of the people who have been working with our show for a while now a little raise. Anyway, but that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.